This presentation provides further information in regards to methodology, application, and outcomes of work undertaken to assess the financial viability of the local plan and the potential community infrastructure levy charging schedule. The aim of this presentation is to provide stakeholders further information and the opportunity to provide further commentary in relation to the work undertaken. The agenda for this presentation will include a general introduction to work that's already been completed in regards to CIL, followed by an assessment of the typologies relating to the developments, the methodology taken to produce the CIL and viability assessment, consideration of the impact of geographical areas, the inputs applied, overall results, and our preliminary conclusions. At the end, there will be a number of questions which will be on the website for stakeholders to respond to. The original CIL charging schedule and viability study relating to affordable housing was undertaken by BNP in 2015. Gerald Eve were appointed to undertake an update to this review and have generally followed the principles set out within it. The objective of this work is to test the Croydon affordable housing policy and CIL levels in regards to current market conditions and evidence available to see whether or not they remain relevant or should be revised. The existing affordable housing policy is effectively 50% affordable housing to be provided on site, subject to viability, with an understanding of at least 30% is expected. The current CIL charging schedule sets out different rates for different areas of the borough and for different uses. Generally, only a single value has been applied, £169 per square metre, allowing for indexation at this time. However, it's been broken into two zones, the central core, CMC, and the rest of the borough. It has also been broken into uses, mainly residential, business, institutions, and other uses. In the core, you can see no CIL is chargeable on residential, whereas in the rest of the borough, a CIL of 169 is currently chargeable. For business, it is the opposite way round, with 169 chargeable in the core area and not chargeable elsewhere in the borough. For institutions, it was determined that no CIL should be charged, and for other uses, 169 is charged in all areas of the borough. In undertaking our assessment, we've had regard to the current national planning policy framework and guidance. Paragraph 3 of the MPG indicates assessing the viability of plans does not require individual testing of every site or the assurance that individual sites are viable. Plan makers can use site typologies to determine viability at the plan making stage. Assessment of sample sites may be helpful to support evidence. In some circumstances, more detailed assessments may be necessary for particular areas or key sites on which delivery of the plan relies. With this understanding, it is recognised that not every site can be tested in the borough, nor that they will all be viable. However, in 2015, BNP tested 54 typologies. In 2020, Gerald Eve added a further 11 additional typologies to this, bringing the total sample up to 65 different typologies, representing a spread of locations around Croydon, development types, as well as sizes. Like BNP's work, a predominant amount of focus is on residential developments, and these were split into minor residential developments, this means schemes under 10 units, medium and large residential developments, mixed use, this means predominantly residential with some sort of commercial uses within them, residential conversions of listed buildings, PRS, as in private rental products, retirement accommodation. In addition, a number of commercial developments were tested, such as offices and industrial. Schools were also tested. However, these typologies were collated into other uses, such as community uses, hotel, etc. The typologies were predominantly based upon applications that have been received by the council over the last few years to ensure that the size of them, scale and location was consistent with that expected within the borough. A step-by-step approach was undertaken to the methodology of assessing the potential CIL and affordable housing within the borough. Firstly, significant amount of data were collected relating to values, costs, etc. And these were applied to the various typologies. We then generated a financial model which tested the residual value of these various typologies. This residual value was then compared to a benchmark land value for each of the typologies. If there was a deficit, then the scheme was regarded as unviable, and if the surplus or the scheme had no surplus or deficit, the scheme was regarded as viable. Sensitivity testing was then undertaken to ensure that the appropriate buffers were included with any final recommendations. The results were then interpreted and general conclusions and recommendations met. A residual method is a simple approach whereby the GDV, the revenue that the scheme makes, is then deducted by development costs, allowances for planning obligations, and a developer's return. This will result in a residual value, which is regarded as the land value. This is then compared to the benchmark land value. The approach taken had full regard to National Planning Policy Framework, NPG, CIL regulations, RTS guidance, as well as other bodies, including the GLA. A primary element of the methodology is determining the benchmark land value. To do this, in accordance with NPG, firstly, we looked at the existing use value of all of the different typologies. Paragraph 13 of the NPG sets out that viability assessments should define benchmark land value having regard to the existing use value, or EUV, of the land, plus a premium for the landowner. The premium for the landowner should reflect a minimum return at which it is considered a reasonable landowner will be willing to sell their land. The premium should provide a reasonable incentive in comparison to other options available for the landowner to sell, while having sufficient contribution to fully comply with policy requirements. We therefore undertook assessments of the various existing use values that the sites currently have in Croydon. This was using values and costs associated with those, as well as looking at market data. We then compared that and what properties are selling for, or have been selling for, having regard to policy in Croydon, to determine the appropriate premium range that should be applied. After adjustment, it was considered that an appropriate range is somewhere between 15 and 40% over existing use values. As previously stated, all typologies must exceed the benchmark land value to be regarded as viable. It is notable in the BMP work that the borough was disaggregated into a number of different regional areas or geographical areas. We can see on these plans, the purple area represents the core, which is the same whether it's residential or commercial. Gerald Eve were then able to, using the data collected on values, determine that there appeared to be various areas of groupings for potential values. This led to us understanding that potentially different parts of the borough were able to generate different values. This was then considered as part of the typology testing in those locations. This table here represents the values in per square metre and per square foot that were calculated from various different sources in relation to residential values across the borough. You can see the purple CMC has the highest values across the borough, with the central area being the orange, the next, and then the yellow and the north, yellow being south, north being blue, having the next. What was quite apparent though is that there is a significant difference in the values associated with the core, the purple, and the rest of the borough, which gave us the ability to consider that we could disaggregate the potential CIL into two zones for testing. A similar approach was taken for the commercial, where first of all we had to determine appropriate rents and yields in the locations and then capitalise those to generate a value. Similarly for hotels, we looked at the values per key, and all other uses were quite similarly approached in terms of rents and yields. You can see that the areas were slightly different to that of residential, with Purley Way being a core area for commercial uses. We also were able to identify slightly different variants in the northern and southern areas compared to residential. Paragraph 10 of the MPG makes it clear that where possible, we should try and provide simple, transparent, publicly available data. Therefore, given the typologies are relatively generic, we applied BCIS build costs for different types of typologies across the borough, adjusting them, reflecting the median in quarter 2020. As you can see here, there were a number of different build costs per square metre that were applied to the 65 typologies. We haven't presented all the assumptions that have been put into the model, but we've aimed to provide standardized assumptions. A key one of these is the profit return that we've allowed for the various different types. This doesn't mean that individual schemes that come forward for viability testing in the borough should be at these levels, but rather that these reflect an appropriate range for our typologies. Paragraph 18 identifies that for the purpose of plan making, an assumption of circa 15 to 20% of gross development value may be considered a suitable return for developers in order to establish the viability of planning policies. A lower figure may be more appropriate in consideration of delivery of affordable housing circumstances, where this guarantees an end sale of a known value and therefore reduces the risk. As you can see, the assumptions we've applied reflect this. MPG indicates potential risk is accounted for in assumed returns to the developer at the plan making stage, and that it is the role of the developer, not the plan makers or decision makers, to mitigate these risks. Therefore, an element of this risk is associated with the profit returns we've applied. However, through our testing, we've also allowed for contingencies and buffering to our outputs to try and ensure that we've mitigated the risk of applying the CIL rates and affordable housing rates currently assessed, given the market conditions. So on to the results. And we're trying to present these very simply. What you can see here in the first diagram is that for medium and large developments, this means anything that generates more than 10 units. At 35% affordable housing, a significant amount of these are viable with the current CIL rate. Indeed, there is potential for these types of uses to generate further CIL and remain viable. We've also assessed minor schemes, in other words, schemes under 10 units, to see whether or not they could afford a contribution towards affordable housing, because currently they don't have any affordable housing, as well as the current CIL rates. What we found was that there were not a sufficient amount of the typologies tested to really consider that this was an appropriate way to go. What was also apparent was a number of commercial, and we've aggregated them all here, office, retail, leisure, industrial. A significant amount of these were unviable with the current CIL rates. And this continued with things like hotel, education, community uses, etc. And we know that currently these are being charged at £169 per square metre, indicating potentially that these should be reduced. Following our initial tests, we undertook sensitivity to ensure that we had sufficient buffers in our or in any proposed assumptions or outputs to ensure that we maximise the viability and deliverability of developments across the borough. Our initial conclusions are set out here, and what they appear to suggest is that for typologies over 10 units, they can viably support affordable housing at 35%. And they appear to remain viable at 20% affordable housing if through sensitivity stress testing. The majority of residential typologies under 10 units appear to be unable to support a sufficient amount of contributions and remain viable if additional affordable housing payments are added to the CIL. The majority of residential typologies over 10 units did appear to be able to support at least £169 per square metre based on our assumptions, giving the indication that potentially they could support more. We also found out generally that industrial and large offices typologies are viable at existing CIL levels. In other words, at 0 in the outer areas and 169 within the core, suggesting that these should be maintained. Finally, we generally identified that other uses, including hotel, retail and leisure and community uses, had significant viability challenges if the CIL was included, and rather indicated that the CIL should be reduced from 169. So that leads us to a number of questions for the stakeholders to consider. First of these is, have we have a sufficient range of typologies being tested in this study? The 65 that we have tested are attached on the web page where this presentation is for you to review. Is the methodology adopted reasonable and in line with relevant guidance? Do you have any comments on the inputs used in the study? We've identified some of these. Is there any evidence or market data relating to the adopted inputs that you'd like us to take into account or bring to our attention? If there is, please can you provide us this so we can make sure we've included it in our final conclusions? And finally, do you have any comments on the preliminary conclusions that have been presented here? And that ends our presentation.